Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. Reason. Observation of the relation of self-consciousness to its immediate actuality. Physiognomy continued. If we look now at the range of relationships as a whole, in which the self-conscious individuality can be observed to stand towards its outer aspect, there will be one left which has still to be made an object for observation. In psychology, it is the external reality of things, which is supposed to have its self-conscious counterpart in spirit, and to make spirit intelligible. In physiognomy, on the other hand, a spirit is supposed to be known in its own outer aspect, as in a being which is the utterance of spirit, the visible invisibility of its essence. There remains the further determination of the aspect of reality, namely that the individuality expresses its essence in its immediate, firmly established, and purely existent actuality. This last relation is thus distinguished from the physiognomic by the fact that this is the speaking presence of the individual who, in expressing himself in action, at the same time exhibits himself as inwardly reflecting and contemplating himself, an expression which is itself a movement. Features in repose which are themselves essentially a mediated being. In the determination yet to be considered, however, the outer aspect is lastly a wholly immobile reality, which is not in its own self a speaking sign, but separated from self-conscious movement, presents itself on its own account, and is a mere thing. In the first place, in regard to the relation of the inner to its outer, it seems clear that the relation must be grasped as a causal connection, since the relation of one being in itself to another being in itself, qua a necessary relation, is a causal connection. Now, for spirit individuality to have an effect on the body, it must, qua cause, be itself corporeal. The corporeal element, however, in which it acts as cause, is the organ, but the organ not of action against external reality, but of the internal action of the self-conscious being operating outwards only against its own body. It is not at once clear which organs these can be. If we were thinking only of organs in general, the organ for work as such would be quite obvious. Similarly, the organ of sex, and so on. Organs of that sort, however, are to be considered as instruments or parts which spirit, as one extreme, possesses as a middle term against the other extreme, which is the external object. Here, however, is to be understood an organ in which the self-conscious individual, as an extreme, preserves himself for himself against his own corporeal actuality, which is opposed to him, the individual at the same time not being turned to the outer world but reflected in his action, and in which is an organ in which the aspect of being is not a being for another. It is true that in the physiognomic relation, the organ is also considered as an existence reflected into itself and reviewing the action, but this being is an objective being, and the result of the physiognomic observation is this, that self-consciousness confronts its actuality as something to which it is indifferent. This indifference vanishes in the fact that this very reflectedness into self is productive of an effect, thereby that objective existence receives a necessary relation to it. But to act on that existence, the reflectedness into self must itself have a being, though not, strictly speaking, an objective being, and as such an organ, it must be pointed out. Now, in ordinary life, anger, for example, as such an internal action, is located in the liver. Plato even assigns the liver something still higher, something which is even regarded by some as the highest function of all, namely prophesying, or the gift of speaking of holy and eternal things in a non-rational manner. But the movement which the individual has in his liver, heart, and so on, cannot be regarded as wholly reflected into itself. Rather, it is present in such a manner that it has already taken on a corporeal aspect in him, and has an animal existence turning outwards to external reality. The nervous system, on the other hand, is the immediate repose of the organism in its movement. The nerves themselves, it is true, are again the organs of that consciousness which is already immersed in its outward directed activity, brain and spinal cord, however, may be considered as the immediate presence of self-consciousness, A presence which abides within itself is not objective and also does not look outwards, insofar as the moment of being which this organ has is a being for another, that is an outer existence. It is a dead thing, and no longer the presence of self-consciousness. This being within itself, however, is by its very nature a fluid system in which the circle casts into it immediately dissolve, and in which no lasting distinction is expressed. Meanwhile, as spirit itself is not abstractly simple, but a system of movements in which it differentiates itself into moments, but in this very differentiation remains free, and as spirit articulates its body into a variety of functions and allots one particular part for only one function, so too the fluid being of its being within itself can be thought of as articulated into parts, and it seems that it must be thought of in this way because the being of spirit, which is in the brain, is reflected into itself, is itself again only a middle term between spirit's pure essence and its corporeal articulation, a middle term which therefore must partake of the nature of both. The corporeal aspect must therefore also be present in the middle term in the form of immediate being. The spiritually organic being has at the same time the necessary aspect of an inert, enduring existence. The former, qua the extreme of being for self, must step back and have this latter as the other extreme over against it, which is then the object on which the spiritually organic being acts as cause. If now the brain and spinal cord together constitute the corporeal being for self of spirit, the skull and vertebral column form the other extreme to it, an extreme which is separated off, namely the solid inert thing. When, however, anyone thinks of the proper location of spirit's outer existence, it is not the back that comes to mind, but only the head. Therefore, in examining a way of knowing, like the one we are now dealing with, we can be satisfied with this reason, not a very bad reason in this case, in order to confine this existence to the skull. Should it occur to anyone to think of the back as the location of spirit, insofar as by it too, knowing and doing are no doubt sometimes partly driven in and partly driven out, this would be no proof at all that the spinal cord must be taken as included in the indwelling seat of spirit, because this proves too much, for one may equally recall that there are other popular external ways too for getting at the activity of spirit in order to stimulate or inhibit it. The vertebral column is then rightly ruled out, if you like, that the skull alone does not contain the organs of spirit, as well as is as well explained as many other doctrines of philosophy of nature. I know how she feels. For this was previously excluded from the notion of this relation, and for this reason the skull was taken for the aspect of outer existence, or if we are not to be allowed to recall the notion of the relation, then certainly experience teaches that, as it is with the eye, qua organ, that we see, so it is not with the skull that we murder, steal, write poetry, etc. This is the reason why we must also refrain from using the expression organ for that significance of the skull which has still to be mentioned. For although it is commonly said that reasonable men pay attention not to the word but to the thing itself, yet this does not give us permission to describe a thing in terms inappropriate to it, for this is at once incompetence and deceit. To fancy and to pretend that one merely has not the right word, and to hide from oneself that really one has failed to get hold of the right thing itself, that is the notion. If one had the notion, then one would also have the right word. What has been determined here in the first instance is only that just as the brain is the living head, the skull is the corpus mortuum, or corpus, can't remember now, maybe that's right. It is in this dead being, then, that the mental processes and specific functions of the brain would have to display their outer reality, a reality, however, which is still in the individual himself, for the relation of those processes and functions to the skull, which as a dead being does not have spirit dwelling within it, there presents itself in the first instance the external mechanical relation established above, so that the organs proper, and these are in the brain, here press the skull out around, there widen or flatten it, or in whatever other way one cares to represent the action on it. Being itself a part of the organism, it must indeed be credited, as in the case of every bone, with a living, spontaneous, formative activity, so that, from this point of view, it is rather the skull that on its part presses on the brain and fixes its outer boundary, and it is better able to do this, being the harder. But in that case, the same relation would still obtain in the determination of their reciprocal activity. For whether the skull is the determining factor or the factor determined, this would produce no alteration at all in the causal connection, except that the skull would then be made the immediate organ of self-consciousness, because in it, qua cause, would be found the aspect of being for self. But in point of fact, since being for self as an organic spontaneity is equally present in both, any causal connection between them is ruled out. This development of the two, however, would be inwardly connected and would be an organic pre-established harmony which would leave the two interrelated aspects free in respect of each other, each with his own shape to which the shape of the other need not correspond, and still more so as regards the relation between the shape and the quality, just as the shape of the grape and the taste of the wine are mutually independent. But since the determination of being for self falls on the side of the brain, but that of existence on the side of the skull, there is also to be established a causal connection between them with the organic unity, within the organic unity, a necessary relation between them as external for one another, that is, a relation itself external through which, therefore, the shape of each would be determined by the other. However, as regards the determination in which the organ of self-consciousness would act causally on the opposite aspect, all sorts of things can be said, for what is in question is the constitution of a cause which is considered in regard to its indifferent outer existence, its shape and size, a cause whose inner being and being for self are to be precisely of a kind which does not concern the immediate or outer existence. The organic spontaneous formation of the skull is in the first place indifferent to any mechanical influence exerted on it, and the relationship of these two relations, since the former is a relating of itself to itself, is just as very indefiniteness and unboundedness. Furthermore, even if the brain received into itself the distinction of spirit as existential distinctions and were a plurality of internal organs, each occupying a different space, it would be left undetermined whether a spiritual feature would, according as it was originally stronger or weaker, be bound to possess in the first case a more expanded brain organ, or in the latter case a more contracted brain organ, or even the other way about. But this is contradictory to nature for the brain to be such a plurality of internal organs, for nature gives the moments of the notion an existence of their own, and therefore puts the fluid simplicity of organic life dearly on one side, and its articulation and division with its distinctions clearly on the other, so that in the way they are to be grasped here, they display themselves as particular anatomical things. Similarly with the question whether the development of the brain would enlarge or diminish the organ, whether it would make it coarser or thicker or finer, from the fact that it remains undetermined how the cause is constituted, it is equally left undetermined how the effect is produced in the skull, whether it is an enlarging or a narrowing and falling in of the latter. When this influence is defined, as it were, more imposingly as a simulation, it is still undetermined whether this takes place by swelling, like the effect of a Catarrhades plaster, or by shrivelling, like the effect of vinegar. All views of this kind can be supported by plausible grounds for the organic relation which just as much plays a part, accommodates one view as readily as another, and is indifferent to all this cleverness. However, it is not the function of observation to seek to determine this relation. If, for in the case, it is not the brain, qua a physical part, which stands on the one side, but the brain qua the being of the self-conscious individuality, this latter, as a lasting character and spontaneous conscious activity, exists for itself and within itself, over against this being for within itself, within itself, stands its actuality and its existence for another. The being for and within itself is the essence and the subject, which has a being in the brain. This being is subsumed into the subject, under the subject, and gets its value only through its indwelling significance. But the other aspect of self-conscious individuality, the aspect of its outer existence, is being qua independent and subject, or qua a thing, viz. A bone, the actuality and existence of man in his skull bone. This is how the relationship and the two sides of this relation are understood by the consciousness observing them. Observation has now to deal with the more determinate relation of these aspects. The skull bone does have in general the significance of being the immediate actuality of spirit, but the many-sidedness of spirit gives its existence a corresponding variety of meanings. What we have to obtain is the specific meaning of the particular areas into which this existence is divided, and we have to see how these areas contain an indication of that specific meaning. The skull bone is not an organ of activity, not even a speaking movement. We neither commit theft, murder, etc. with the skull bone, nor does it in the least betray such deeds by a change of countenance, so that the skull bone would become a speaking gesture, nor has this immediate being the value even of a sign. Look and gesture, tone of voice, even the pillar or post erected on a desert island directly proclaim that they mean something else than what they simply are at first sight. They at once profess to be signs, since they have in them a peculiarity which points to something else by the fact that it does not properly belong to them. A variety of ideas may well occur to us in connection with the skull, like those of Hamlet over Yorick's skull, but the skull bone just by itself is such an indifferent natural thing that nothing else is to be directly seen in it or fancied about it than simply the bone itself. It does indeed remind us of the brain and its specific nature, and of skulls of a different formation, but not of a conscious movement, since there is impressed on it neither a look, nor a gesture, nor anything that proclaims itself to have come from a conscious action. For it is an actuality whose role it is to exhibit another sort of aspect of the individuality, one that would no longer be a self-reflected, but a purely immediate being. Further, while the skull bone does not itself feel, it seems that perhaps a more specific significance could still be found for it in the fact that specific feelings through the proximity to the skull might enable us to ascertain what it is that the skull means to convey, and when a conscious mode of spirit has its feeling in a specific area of the skull, the shape of this part of the skull might perhaps indicate what that mode is, and what is its special nature, just as, for example, some people complain of feeling a painful tension somewhere in the head when they are thinking hard, or even when they are thinking at all, so too could stealing, committing murder, writing poetry, and so on, each be accompanied by its own feeling, which besides would necessarily be localized in its own special place. This area of the brain, which would in this way be more moved and activated, would probably also develop the adjacent area of the skull bone, or again, this particular area would from sympathy or consensus not be inert, but would enlarge or diminish itself or modify its shape in some way or other. What, however, makes this hypothesis improbable is this, that feeling as such is something indeterminate, and feeling in the head as the centre might be the general sympathetic feeling accompanying all forms of suffering, so that mixed up with thieves, murderers, poets, head itching or head ache or other feelings which could as little be distinguished from one another, and also from those we can call merely bodily feelings, as an illness can be diagnosed from the symptom of headache, if we restrict its significance merely to the bodily aspect. In fact, from whatever side we look at the matter, there is no necessary reciprocal relation at all between them, nor any direct indication of such a relation. If all the same the relation is still to exist, what remains and is necessary to form it is an irrational, free, pre-established harmony of the corresponding determination of the two aspects, for one of the two aspects is to be a non-spiritual reality, a mere thing. On the one side, then, we have a multitude of inert areas of the skull. On the other, a multitude of mental properties whose number and character will depend on the state of psychology. The more paltry the conception of spirit, the easier becomes the task from this side, for partly the mental properties become fewer, and partly they become more detached, rigid and ossified, and therefore more akin to characteristics of the bone, and more comparable with them. But, although the task is made much easier by the paltry conception of spirit, yet there still remains a very good deal to be done on both sides. There remains for observation the entire contingency of their relation. If the children of Israel, who were likened in number to the sands of the seashore, should each take unto himself the grain of sand which stood for him, the indifference and arbitrariness of such a procedure would be no more glaring than that which assigns to every faculty of soul, to every passion, and what must equally be considered here, to each nuance of character, which the more refined psychology and knowledge of human nature likes to talk about, its particular area of skull and shape of skull bone. The skull of a murderer has not this organ or even sign, but this bump. But this murderer has as well a multitude of other properties, just as he has other bumps, and along with the bumps also hollows. One has the choice of bumps and hollows, and again his murderous disposition can be related to any bump or hollow, and this in turn to any mental property, for the murderer is neither merely the abstraction of a murderer, nor does he have only one bump and one hollow. The observations indulged in on this point must just for that reason sound as sensible as those of the dealer and the housewife about rain at the annual fair and on wash day. Dealer and housewife might as well make the observation that it always rains when a particular neighbour goes by, or when they eat roast pork. Just as rain is indifferent to circumstances like this, so too, from the standpoint of observation, a particular determinateness of spirit is indifferent to a particular formation of the skull. For the two objects of this observation, one is a dry, sapless being for itself, an ossified property of spirit, the other is an equally sapless being in itself. Such an ossified thing as both are is completely indifferent to everything else. It is just as much a matter of indifference to the high bump whether a murderer is in its vicinity, as it is to the murderer, where the flatness is close by him. Hegel moved on to phrenology there. Moving on from physiognomy. Phenomenology, that will be covered in the next video. Meanwhile, I think I might go for some soup, like these two guys.